Here's something strange that happened in the vicinity of Johntown, Pennsylvania, specifically near Kamahoning Lake by Cring Street, located along Jerome Hill Road, Somerset County. This began in spring 2014, around 8 p.m., when a good friend of mine mentioned witnessing what seemed to be an odd entity lurking in the dense forest near his home. Although he never explicitly referred to it as any known creature, his curious yet somewhat fearful accounts intrigued me, so I decided to investigate. In the few times I ventured out, I noticed a few abnormal indications. Some sturdy tree limbs were uncharacteristically snapped, their breakage almost insinuating something of great strength had caused this. In one incident, I had a friend, who stands 5'5", provide perspective by standing next to the broken branches, a sight that seemed even more peculiar when captured in a photograph. One remarkable discovery was an oddly assembled refuge that barely accommodated a human figure in its structure. This would suggest that I was not dealing with known wildlife. In my exploration, I noticed one thing that remained constant: a smell. It was a pungent, musky scent, entering our nostrils even before we could set our foot onto the dirt pathway leading to the wooded area. Perhaps it was territorial marking or a deterrent, but it signaled the presence of this unknown entity. Most of these sightings occurred around the Kamahoning Lake. It would seem that the entity used the lake as its primary route for navigation, and possibly for provisions too. Considering the diversity of fish species in this lake, it could serve as a viable food source. Crowded with several parks and surrounded by dense woods, it offered a secluded landscape, optimal conditions for the entity to roam without interruption. The narrative provided by locals varied in details, mostly in terms of size and color attributed to the entity. Most narratives settled around a dirt brown hue and a rough texture attributed to its hide or hair, with some instances reporting a reddish shade and almost moss-like consistency. There was also talk about the entity's face, mostly obscured, but there was consensus on the eyes, which stood out with a definitive gleam. If these accounts were anything to go by, I could safely assume that whatever this entity was, it had adapted well to the woodland's greenery, allowing it to blend and navigate effortlessly and stealthily. On my last exploration, near dusk, we spotted the entity once again. It swiftly appeared from behind a nearby tree, its eyes shimmering in the descending twilight. The sight of it startled me, and in reaction, I stifled a gasp, which seemed to catch its attention. As it turned its massive figure towards me, I receded slowly, my companion under my grip, not wanting to elicit any potential aggression. I reached my vehicle, left the vicinity, and quickly returned with a hunting rifle borrowed from a neighbor. Upon returning, the entity was nowhere to be found. Neither were any signs of recent movement detected. However, massive footprints were left where the entity had previously stood, stark against the bed of fallen leaves, offering an uncanny testament to whatever had stood there. This was the last episode directly involving the entity. Although there have been no fresh encounters since the incident nearly 6 years ago, neither of them have since ventured into the woods without caution. We keep an eye out and lend an ear to any related talk amongst the locals. The remote location, coupled with few outdoor enthusiasts venturing near, make any newer accounts of a sighting or encounter relatively scarce. The entity has not caused any harm or destruction, and despite the frightening encounters, no one has been harmed. However, the local community remains cautiously respectful of its presence and continues to investigate avowed sightings and reports in an attempt to understand the entity. As these odd encounters continue to baffle us, we hope your spectral and monster expertise could provide us with some insight. Thank you for your time and consideration. I've lived all my life right outside the Washington State's Olympic National Park, in a town called Forks, part of Clallam County, about a mile from Lake Pleasant, on my folks' property. They're passed away now. As far back as I remember, back in '82 or so until about '01, my younger sister Jenny, who was just 4 years old then, stormed into the house one day, terrified, babbling about a hairy giant that was tearing a part of fish apart. Dad was into commercial fishing, and sometimes we'd find bins busted open and fish torn to pieces. Nighttime was the real terror. None of us kids dared venture outside. The forests were pitch black out there on those rural roads. We would all huddle together, hearing heavy footsteps and the snap of tree branches throughout the night. Mom once saw those big footprints. Since Dad was part native, he advised us to let it be. Never disturb the hairy beast or shoot at it for fear of angering it. One cold winter night in 2010, approximately 3:30 a.m., my wife Maria and I were returning from a party in Port Angeles. It was a typical northwestern winter, dark, heavily overcast with a light drizzle. Driving west on Route 101, just a couple miles east of Lake Crescent, our headlights caught a stark outline. It was a huge silhouette crossing the road from the trees on the left to the trees on the right. From what I could see, it seemed to be bent slightly forward, maybe struggling with the incline of the road. Its legs were heavily built, legs of a creature that spends its life walking or running in the woods. It had a very weathered, grayish fur or hair that was sparse enough for the skin to be visible in certain parts. In a couple of seconds, it had crossed the road and was swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Maria immediately turned on the high beams to better illuminate the area it had gone into, but we couldn't see anything. I asked her, "Did you see that?" It was a stale question. Of course, she'd seen what I'd seen. She blurted a soft, "Yes." We both fell silent for the rest of the trip back home. The sighting clearly shook us. It's been 10 years since that moment. We've never spoken about it to anyone in our circles, not even our children. The memory lay dormant in the back of my mind, until yesterday, while Redditing, I came across a thread about an alleged Bigfoot sighting in our area. The storyteller's description seemed eerily similar to ours: the gait, the coarse fur, and of course the size. The post brought back a flood of near-forgotten fear and curiosity. I asked Maria about that night. She, too, was surprised that I brought it up. She had repressed the memory as something surreal that was probably a figment of her imagination. I've been hiking around Black Rock Forest Reserve for the past 5 months. Starting about a week ago, I began to notice an oddly unsettling smell and some unusual whooping sounds. At first, I ignored it, thinking it may be just local animals, mostly because I've heard quite a lot of animal screams here. It's also worth mentioning that my faithful hiking companion, my dog, seemed quite agitated and frightened during our most recent hikes. The last hike we went on was rather late, around 8 till 9:30 p.m., when it was already dark. We experienced several tree knock sounds almost too close for comfort, and a few pebbles seemed to be thrown our way. My initial impression was perhaps local kids messing around until I neared a hidden pond deep inside the forest. What happened next still makes me shiver. I am now convinced it was a Sasquatch that practically sprinted out almost 10 feet ahead of me, paused for what seemed like a lifetime but was probably just 15 seconds, let out a deep, resonant whoop sound, and disappeared, bolting into the heart of the forest. Around 9 p.m. on March 17th, 2007, my friend, my trusty old retriever, and I planned on spending the evening hiking. Armed with a couple of beanies and leather gloves to keep the chill at bay, we set off around 8:30 p.m. under the clear, starlit sky. The pathway we chose ran straight through the densest part of Black Rock Forest Reserve. As we ventured deeper into the woods, the dog started pacing erratically, eyes glued to the deepening shadows. We dismissed his skittish behavior until we reached the hidden pond, our usual rest spot. As we attempted to find a spot to sit and revel in the peace and quiet, we heard a resonating whoop from the tree line close by. The dog immediately took off towards the sound, barking wildly. We called out to him repeatedly, but he totally ignored us. My friend, deciding to light our way towards the dog using his phone's flashlight, instead ended up creating shadowy illusions, where dark figures loomed and retreated mysteriously. Stirred by curiosity, we displayed our cell phones towards the uncannily silent woodlands, but instead of illuminating the pines, we saw a hulking figure dart away swiftly into the forest undergrowth. The way it moved, the deep, echoey sound it made, it was far from human or animal. The only logical explanation that sprang to my mind was, it had to be a Bigfoot. All the blood drained from our faces, we scrambled back towards the safer, well-lit parts of the park, stumbling over tree roots and rocks, leaving our tranquil spot far behind. We didn't stop to catch our breath until we burst into the local sheriff's station, gasping out our encounter with what we believed to be a Sasquatch. Skeptical yet intrigued, the sheriff promised to look into it, but the fear in our eyes and the dog's refusal to leave the station told our tale louder than our words ever could. Untouched was the silence we carried back home, and the lingering fear of whatever we had seen that night. We never returned to the trail after dark again. As of today, I am 48 years old, a veterinary surgeon, and my friend, a valued member of the local police force. It may have been more than a decade, but we remember that night as if it was yesterday. There are many of us out there holding on to our encounters with the unknown, maybe hoping just like us for some answers. In the summer of '95, my buddy and I decided to take his 20-foot fiberglass fishing boat out on Clear Lake, Northern California. For most of the day, we were catching largemouth near the shores, before deciding to take a break as dusk set in. My friend suggested we take a quick tour of the lake. We cruised around leisurely for a bit before deciding to anchor up in a sizable inlet across from Soda Bay. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we noticed violent rustling coming from a scrubby slope about 70 meters off, where the vegetation was so dense it was almost impassable. This rustling was accompanied by aggressive snorting noises. Unable to see what was causing this disturbance, we assumed it must be a large antlered deer crashing through the vegetation. But then, we were startled as a hefty boulder, weighing at least 8 to 12 pounds, flew towards us and landed with a loud splash several feet away from our boat. As my friends started the engine, we switched on the high beam of the boat's floodlights onto the steep slope, and that's when we saw it. It seemed to have been camouflaged perfectly, but the sudden lights exposed it against the dense background. An unusual bipedal creature, its fur-kissed skin blending against the backdrop. The sudden light startled it, and it turned to look straight at us. For a brief moment, the lights hit its eyes, reflecting back an eerie glow before it turned around and retreated into the woods. Although we've been back to Clear Lake several times since that day, we've yet to see anything remotely close to that incident. It's been years now, and I still struggle to explain what it exactly was that we had encountered that night. Yet, the chilling memory remains with me up till today. About 3 years ago, while I was exploring the trail along the Des Plaines River in Lake County, Illinois, with a fellow hiker. This area is predominantly frequented by hikers, birdwatchers, and on occasion, foragers like us. An incident occurred that to this day disturbs our sense of reality. During one of our usual hikes, we stumbled upon a stretch of approximately 12 feet of footprints following a partially dried out gully. What was intriguing was that the gully shifted from being a wet runoff into a muddy spot and then returning back to the waterlogged ground. It appeared as if someone had emerged from the water, walked across the muddy terrain, leaving behind footprints, and then disappeared back into the watery continuation of the gully. These footprints stood out because they resembled those of a barefooted adult, with clear impressions of toes and heel marks. However, the size was absolutely mind-numbing. The footprints were larger than any human foot, at least twice the size of a man's shoe. We estimated around US size 22 or more, and reeked of an unearthly feeling. They were abnormally deep enough to make an impression on the hardest of grounds. My friend, sturdier than me, had this fearful look in his eyes, something I had never seen before. I suggested we should follow those footprints to see if they lead somewhere, maybe to the owner of them. But he was too scared and insisted we hurriedly leave the spot. And so we left, feeling a cold sensation of being watched as we retreated. 2 days later, we mustered courage and decided to revisit the spot, armed with a camera to capture those footprints. We thought maybe someone could help us understand. However, the rapid current had washed away this chilling evidence of anything that could have possibly transpired that night. This event has left us deeply puzzled and inexplicably fearful. During the course of the next few weeks, there were 1 or 2 accounts of bizarre, inhuman screams echoing through the forest. Could they be related? It's horrifying to even fathom. After this incident, we stopped venturing to our once beloved trail. This strange occurrence happened in Lake County in March. With temperatures as low as 20 degrees Fahrenheit, it certainly isn't the friendliest weather for anyone to be walking barefooted, let alone through freezing sloughs. To this day, we can't figure out the reasoning behind those footprints. It's quite a stretch, but could it be a Bigfoot? We've never been believers of this creature, rather the type to joke about its mythical existence. But the undeniable evidence, albeit short-lived, has left us dumbstruck. This was neither a dream nor folklore, but a real-life experience that we find ourselves questioning every time we recount it, hoping to find that could have possibly transpired that night. This event has left us deeply puzzled and inexplicably fearful. As a kid, I used to reside near Henderson, Nevada. My folks owned a property southwest of town. We approximately resided about 3 or 4 miles away from the exact opening of Area 51 and the adjacent black box. My growing up years were back in the late 1980s, before the facility was extensively known. During the nights, often we would see unusual lights emanating from the direction of Area 51. One particular evening, I remember observing a luminous orb of light with a trailing line, moving along the eastern horizon and then changing its course drastically, tracing the same path back. My dad termed it an UFO light, saying that several could be sighted in a single night during his young days. A standout event that I can vividly recall happened on my 12th birthday in September 1989. After a quiet family gathering on our home's patio, I was led inside by my dad to prepare s'mores. My dad mostly insisted on boundaries with the Area 51 despite the handful of UFO sightings, because he respected the privacy of the government facilities. As we prepared to head inside, he quickly set up our own miniature smoke barrier that he used to do, somewhat out of whimsy, triggered by popular folktales of his time. While we were inside, an unusual bright light entered into our room from the window, almost like the high beams of a truck, but it was floating right above the ground. Given the frequency of UFO stories and encounters, it wasn't hard for us to imagine it as an alien spacecraft. We rushed to our backyard for a closer look, and believe me, that oddly bright light looming over the horizon seemed even more extraordinary up close. Feeling a bit scared, we retreated inside and decided that sleep was a better idea. In the next few hours, we started noticing odd shapes lurking in the shadows that my dad dismissed as some effect of the bright light we witnessed. Still, we continued to hear some peculiar noises outside for the rest of the night. The next day, as dawn broke, we were eager to know if there was any unusual activity around our home. However, we went about our normal activities, trying to shrug off the previous night's events. Oddly enough, there were no physical signs or proof of anything extraordinary. That day, after dinner, we decided to head towards where the light had struck the previous night, half nervous, half excited. That's when we reached an open field adjacent to our property. There, we saw patches of our grass that had strange, geometrical patterns engraved onto them. It was something I'd never seen before. Then suddenly, as I looked up, I saw something that made my heart jump. It was a giant shadowy figure, taller than any tree around, and seemed to have an unusually radiating aura. It looked like the outline of a man, but with long arms and a disfigured structure. Never in my life had I seen such a terrifying sight. Frozen from fear, we couldn't move. Gathering our senses after a bit, we decided to back away slowly and return to our house. We huddled together as the dark figure continued to gaze in our direction. The next day, we moved as far away from there as we could. I know many won't believe my encounter, but that's fine. We are always wiser in hindsight. Living an event tends to drain out the judiciousness from our decision-making capabilities. The sighting has stayed with me over these years. I can still see that silhouette in my dreams sometimes, just standing there, watching us. Looking back, I think we just got too close to something we weren't meant to understand. Just chiming in to share a disconcerting incident that my boyfriend experienced 3 years ago in April 2016 in our apartment complex in Fort Lauderdale. He is hesitant to share this and labels it as some vivid nightmare, but his relentless reiterations of the entire event has made me start to contemplate the possibility of it being more than just that. My boyfriend hasn't had any history of sleep paralysis or night terrors, making this nightmare all the more peculiar. I, on the other hand, have always held a deep fascination for the metaphysical, psychedelia, and unexplained phenomena. After much persuasion, I managed to convince him to let me share this event on here and see what everyone else might think of it. Further, we're open to discussing the incident and answering your queries. Here's the event, shared exactly as he narrated it to me. He recounts waking just before dawn to find three unanticipated visitors in our bedroom. There was a stout one standing to the left of our dresser, with two larger ones, one on each side of the smaller one. Another figure seemed to be standing at the entrance of our room, by the living room. He distinctly remembers a sense of paralytic fear running through him. For some reason, it felt to him that they did not mean us harm, but their countenance and general presence was enough to keep him from stirring or making any noise. All he could do was move his eyes around breathlessly. Their countenances, as mentioned, were not particularly frightening or grotesque, but had an aura of strangeness about them. They looked humanoid, with torsos somewhat resembling that of a human being. However, their skin had a sort of red hue, which was illuminated in an eerie way by the dim blue light of our AC unit. Their eyes were this strange kind of luminescent yellow color. Their limbs seemed longer than ours, hands and fingers slightly elongated. Posture-wise, they appeared quite poised and controlled, hardly making any noise or errant movements. Suddenly, one of the larger ones seemed to utter something. It made a strange, high-pitched clicking sound, which reverberated softly throughout our quiet bedroom. The others then made similar sounds in response, and what seemed like a discussion among them started. To him, it sounded like a complex language consisting of clicks and murmurs, completely unknown to his ears. He recalls that despite his fear, he was also strangely fascinated with their language. However, the truly uncanny event was yet to unfold. After a few moments of their discussion, they all simultaneously turned their heads to look at the old grandfather clock we had sitting in the dining area. It's an antique piece, passed down through generations in my family. I'd always loved the grandfather clock for its vintage look, and because it was one of my grandmother's old things. The moment their attention turned to the clock, something impossible occurred. The pendulum of the clock started swinging incredibly fast, and the wheels within started turning haphazardly, gears moving faster than they ever should, and the hands of the clock started spinning as if time was fast-forwarding. Suddenly, there was this incredible sound that filled the room. It was like a crystalline hum, almost musical, somewhat harmonious yet highly discomforting. It persisted for close to 10 minutes, during which the movements of everything in the room seemed accelerated, as if time itself had become awry. Finally, with a loud mechanical groan, the grandfather clock came to an abrupt halt, and the strange visitors simultaneously turned around and seemingly vanished. One moment they were there, the next, they weren't. He was finally able to breathe properly. The rest of the day was spent in shock and disbelief. This happened exactly at sunrise, marking the end of what had been a fear-inducing yet fascinating encounter. To this day, he and I have no logical explanation for this. Was it sleep paralysis, an overactive imagination, or was it something a bit more inexplicable? Any thoughts or opinions on this are welcome. This can't be anything more than just an odd, one-off event that's etched onto our memories, but sometimes it leaves us thinking, what if? Late afternoon around 5:30 p.m., still quite bright here in Bucky Lake, Ohio. I was on my return route on Watkins Island Drive, going toward Lakeshore Drive East. I got startled by an unusual moving dark figure. Above the line of lakeside houses, somewhere hovering above the Leibs Island area, this strange silhouette came into notice. Quickly detoured my pickup truck, turned right onto Lakeshore Drive East, and parked near Anchor's Way to get a clearer view. I caught sight of a couple exiting one of the nearby lakeside houses prepping their boat. I gestured towards the shockingly bizarre object in question. Bewildered, they asked if it was a drone. I shrugged helplessly, equally clueless. It paced steadily on a direct course over the lake. Undeterred, I drove out to Leibs Island, parked, and called my wife at our house, a humble little home with a lake view, all the while observing the figure becoming increasingly minuscule while it vanished over the horizon. I made the short trip home, my wife already peering out the window, binoculars at the ready. She was tracing the now mere speck until it was swallowed by the twilight. I joined her at the window, and we stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, we sighed, looked at each other, and shared an uneasy chuckle before heading into the night. When you live in a small town like ours, word travels fast. By next morning, our mysterious traveler was the talk of the town, each person attempting to make sense of this peculiar incident, figuring out their versions. Everyone agreed on one fact, though: no one had seen anything like that before. After that day, my evenings took on a new routine. I found myself watching the sunset low over the lake, binoculars at the ready. I diligently observed any odd movement over the lake. I never saw it again. The strange figure remained an enigma, a footnote in Buckeye Lake lore. Do any of you Buckeye Lake folks remember this? Happened on October 10th, 2016. Love to hear folks chime in on this. Remember, our lake always has a new tale to tell, if one is patient enough to listen and look. Stay curious, friends.